India's history is all about its land, the vast and fertile plains, the rich and diverse ecosystems, and the hard-working farmers who have tilled this land for centuries. The story of India is deeply intertwined with its agriculture, which has been the backbone of its economy and culture for thousands of years. From the earliest days of civilization, the Indian subcontinent has been a land of plenty, where the bounty of the earth has sustained its people and nurtured its growth. For a super long time, Indian farmers grew lots of different crops. They cultivated a wide variety of grains, fruits and vegetables, each suited to the unique climate and soil of their region. Wheat, rice, barley and millet were staples, while spices like turmeric, cardamom and black pepper added flavor to their cuisine and value to their trade. The diversity of crops not only ensured food security, but also supported a vibrant and dynamic agricultural economy. These crops fed a huge civilization that lived near the Indus and Ganges rivers. The fertile floodplains of these mighty rivers provided the perfect conditions for agriculture to flourish. Ancient cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro thrived on the surplus produce, enabling them to develop complex societies with advanced technologies, trade networks, and cultural achievements. The abundance of food allowed people to pursue arts, crafts, and sciences, laying the foundation for a rich and enduring heritage. From the tall Himalayas to the southern tip of India, different weather and soil helped grow lots of food. The diverse geography of India, with its mountains, plains, plateaus and coastal regions, created a mosaic of microclimates that supported a wide range of agricultural practices. The monsoon rains, vital for irrigation, brought life to the fields, while the varied terrain allowed for the cultivation of everything from tea in the highlands to coconuts along the coast. This natural bounty made India a land of plenty, where the earth's gifts were celebrated and cherished. This meant lots of food for everyone and made India a big trading center for many years. The surplus produce not only fed the local population but also fueled trade with distant lands. Indian spices, textiles and agricultural products were highly sought after in markets across Asia, Africa and Europe. The bustling bazaars and trade routes of ancient India were hubs of commerce and cultural exchange, where goods, ideas and traditions flowed freely, enriching both the traders and the civilizations they connected. But when the British East India Company came in the 1600s, things changed. The arrival of the British marked the beginning of a new and challenging chapter in India's agricultural history. Initially, they came as traders, eager to tap into the wealth of India's natural resources and thriving markets. However, their ambitions soon grew, and they began to exert control over the land and its people, transforming the landscape of Indian agriculture in ways that would have lasting consequences. They started as traders, but became rulers, and that hurt India's farms. The British imposed new policies and practices that prioritized their own economic interests over the well-being of Indian farmers. Traditional farming methods were disrupted, and the focus shifted to cash crops that could be exported for profit. This shift not only undermined the diversity and sustainability of Indian agriculture, but also placed immense pressure on the farmers, who struggled to adapt to the new demands and constraints. The British wanted money and power. Their primary goal was to extract as much wealth as possible from the land, and they were willing to exploit India's resources and people to achieve it. The introduction of new taxes, land revenue systems and commercial farming practices all served to enrich the British at the expense of the local population. The traditional balance between agriculture, community and environment was disrupted, leading to widespread hardship and discontent. They saw India's good land as a way to get rich. The fertile fields that had sustained generations of Indian farmers were now seen as assets to be exploited for maximum profit. The British introduced monoculture farming, focusing on crops like cotton, indigo and opium, which were in high demand in international markets. This shift not only depleted the soil and reduced biodiversity, but also left Indian farmers vulnerable to market fluctuations and crop failures. This wasn't fair, and it hurt India's farms and its people. The exploitation and mismanagement of the land led to declining agricultural productivity and increasing poverty among farmers. Many were forced to abandon their ancestral lands and migrate to cities in search of work, while those who remained faced mounting debts and diminishing returns. The once thriving agricultural communities were now struggling to survive, their livelihoods and traditions under threat. The British changed India's villages. They introduced new land tenure systems that disrupted traditional village life and eroded communal bonds. The zamindari system, for example, placed land ownership in the hands of a few landlords who often exploited the tenant farmers working under them. This shift in power dynamics further marginalized the rural population and concentrated wealth and control in the hands of a few. They made farmers grow crops that the British wanted, not what the people needed. The focus on cash crops meant that less land was available for growing food, leading to food shortages and famines. The British policies prioritized export-oriented agriculture, which benefited their economy but left the local population vulnerable to hunger and malnutrition. The traditional knowledge and practices that had sustained Indian agriculture for centuries were devalued and replaced with methods that prioritized profit over people. This wasn't fair and hurt India's farmers. The relentless focus on cash crops and the exploitation of the land took a heavy toll on the farmers, who faced increasing hardships and declining yields. The loss of food security, coupled with the economic pressures imposed by the British, created a cycle of poverty and despair that was difficult to break. The resilience and ingenuity of Indian farmers were tested to their limits as they struggled to navigate the challenges imposed by colonial rule. The British taking over India is a story about them taking food and making people poor. The legacy of British colonialism in India is one of exploitation and inequality, where the wealth and resources of the land were extracted for the benefit of a foreign power, leaving the local population to bear the brunt of the consequences. The impact on India's agriculture was profound, with long-lasting effects that are still felt today. The story of India's land is a testament to the resilience of its people, who have endured and overcome immense challenges to reclaim their heritage and rebuild their communities. The British East India Company started as traders, arriving in India with the intention of buying and selling goods. They were initially welcomed by local rulers and merchants, who saw an opportunity for profitable trade. The company brought with them ships laden with European goods, which they exchanged for Indian spices, textiles, and other valuable commodities. However, over time, the British East India Company slowly took over India. They didn't just want to trade, they wanted control. They began to build forts and maintain armies ostensibly to protect their trading interests. But these military forces soon became tools of conquest, used to subdue local rulers and expand British territory. The primary goal of the company was to make lots of money for their bosses in England. The directors and shareholders of the company were driven by the pursuit of profit, and they saw India's vast resources as a means to achieve their financial ambitions. The wealth generated from Indian trade and exploitation filled the coffers of the British aristocracy, leading to grand celebrations and a lavish lifestyle back in England. To maximize their profits, the company used India's land and farmers. They imposed new agricultural practices and demanded that farmers grow cash crops like indigo, cotton, and opium, which were highly profitable in European markets. This shift in farming practices disrupted traditional agricultural systems and placed immense pressure on Indian farmers. The company was tricky and mean. They employed deceitful tactics to gain control over Indian territories. They manipulated local politics, pitting rulers against each other and exploiting internal conflicts. Through a combination of diplomacy, bribery, and military force, they secured treaties that favored British interests and undermined the sovereignty of Indian states. They used their power to trick local rulers, make unfair deals, and take over lots of land in India. These deals often involved the cession of territory and the payment of hefty tributes to the company. The British officials, with their superior knowledge of legal and administrative systems, crafted agreements that were heavily skewed in their favor, leaving Indian rulers with little choice but to comply. One of the worst things they did was start the zamindari system. This system appointed local landlords, known as zamindars, to collect taxes from the farmers. The zamindars were given significant power and authority, and in return, they were expected to ensure a steady flow of revenue to the company. This meant local landlords collected taxes from farmers, and the taxes were way too high. The zamindars, driven by their own greed and the pressure to meet the company's demands, often imposed exorbitant taxes on the farmers. This led to widespread exploitation and suffering among the rural population. These landlords became mean and took advantage of the farmers. They used their power to extract as much wealth as possible, often resorting to harsh and inhumane methods. The farmers, already burdened by the demands of cash crop cultivation, found themselves trapped in a cycle of debt and poverty. Farmers already had to grow crops the British wanted, and now they had to pay high taxes too. The combination of forced crop cultivation and oppressive taxation left the farmers with little to no resources for their own sustenance. They were compelled to prioritize the production of cash crops over food crops, leading to food shortages and increased vulnerability to famine. This made them very poor. The relentless exploitation by the British East India Company and the Zamindars drained the wealth of rural communities. Villages that were once prosperous and self-sufficient became impoverished and destitute, with farmers struggling to make ends meet. This is when the problems with food and farming really started. The disruption of traditional agricultural practices, combined with the economic strain imposed by the British, led to a decline in food production. The once fertile lands of India began to suffer, and the seeds of exploitation sown by the British East India Company would have long-lasting and devastating effects on the country's agrarian society. Cotton, called white gold, was very important for Britain and India. This precious crop was not just a plant, it was a symbol of wealth and prosperity. For centuries, India was renowned for its high-quality cotton, which was sought after by traders from all over the world. The fertile lands of India produced cotton that was spun into fine fabrics, admired for their softness and durability. Before the British, India made really good cotton clothes that everyone wanted. Indian artisans were skilled in weaving and dyeing, creating beautiful textiles that were traded across continents. The bustling markets of India were filled with vibrant cotton fabrics, each piece telling a story of craftsmanship and tradition. These textiles were not just commodities, they were a part of India's cultural heritage. The British East India Company wanted that money, so they took over the cotton business. They saw the immense potential for profit and decided to control the entire process from cultivation to export. British officials and soldiers enforced policies that favoured their interests, often at the expense of local farmers and artisans. The once thriving Indian cotton industry began to change under British rule. They stopped India from selling its clothes by making taxes very high. These taxes were so burdensome that many Indian merchants could no longer afford to trade. Protests erupted, but the British were determined to maintain their monopoly. The high taxes crippled the local economy, making it difficult for Indian businesses to survive. The traditional markets that once thrived with activity now faced decline. Then they brought cheap clothes from Britain and sold them in India. These imported goods were mass-produced in British factories, often using cotton sourced from India itself. The influx of cheap British textiles flooded the Indian markets, making it nearly impossible for local artisans to compete. The vibrant stalls that once showcased Indian craftsmanship were now filled with foreign goods. Indian farmers had to grow cotton instead of food, and they became poor. The British policies forced many farmers to prioritize cotton cultivation over food crops. This shift had devastating consequences as it led to food shortages and increased poverty. Families struggled to make ends meet, and the once self-sufficient communities became dependent on British imports for their basic needs. The cotton went to Britain, became clothes, and then was sold back to India for a lot of money. This cycle of exploitation ensured that the profits remained in British hands. Indian raw materials were transformed into finished products in British factories, creating jobs and wealth in Britain while leaving Indian workers with little to show for their labour. The economic imbalance grew, with British factory owners reaping the benefits. This destroyed India's cotton business and made British factory owners rich, while Indian farmers became poor. The once flourishing Indian cotton industry was reduced to a shadow of its former self. British businessmen celebrated their profits while Indian farmers faced a bleak future. The legacy of this exploitation is still felt today as the impact of colonial policies continues to shape the economic landscape of India. Spices. The smell of trouble. India, the land of spices, had special smells that everyone loved. Pepper, cinnamon, cardamom, turmeric and ginger. These spices were once traded fairly, but the British changed that. The East India Company wanted these spices for Europe. They took over the spice business. Indian farmers had to grow spices but got very little money. The company controlled everything about spices. They set the prices, told farmers how much to grow, and even hurt farmers who didn't listen. The spice trade made the British Empire rich, but Indian farmers stayed poor. The nice smell of Indian spices now reminded people of how unfair the British were. A rice-feeding Britain, starving India. Rice is important food in India, but the British wanted to sell things like indigo and opium, so they made farmers grow those instead of rice. This meant there wasn't enough rice for people in India. The British even took rice from India and sold it to other countries, even when people in India were hungry. The Bengal famine of 1943, when millions of Indians died, happened because of this. The British didn't care that people were starving. Rice, which should have meant there was lots of food, now meant that the British were